That night, Dean Martin learned something no father should, and still walked on stage smiling. The call came at 3:47 in the afternoon. Dean Martin was in his dressing room at NBC getting ready for The Tonight Show. He had done this hundreds of times. The routine was muscle memory by now. Comb the hair, check the tie, pour a drink, or pretend to. The glass was always there, whether it had anything in it or not. That was part of the act. That was Dean. But when the phone rang, something in the room shifted. His manager answered it first. Dean was adjusting his cufflinks, half listening. Then he saw the man's face change. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies. Just a small tightening around the mouth. A hesitation before speaking. That's when Dean knew. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't ask what happened. He just took the phone. The voice on the other end was calm. Professional. It belonged to someone whose job it was to deliver bad news without falling apart. The words came in fragments. Plane crash. March Air Force Base. Captain Dean Paul Martin. No survivors. Dean didn't say anything for a long time. He stood there, holding the phone, staring at a spot on the wall that didn't mean anything. His manager reached out, maybe to take the phone back, maybe just to touch his shoulder. Dean pulled away. Not harshly. Just enough to make it clear he needed space. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. He said thank you. He hung up. Then he sat down in the chair by the mirror and didn't move. No one knew what to do. The manager stepped outside and spoke to one of the producers, quietly, carefully. The producer's face went pale. He looked through the doorway at Dean, who was still sitting in that chair, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. Someone said they should cancel. Someone else said they should tell Johnny. A third voice said maybe they should wait. Give Dean a minute to decide for himself. But no one went back into that room. Because Dean Martin had built a career on making things look easy, on making people believe that nothing ever hurt him, that he was untouchable, that life rolled off his back like water off glass. And now everyone standing outside that dressing room understood the weight of that image. Because if Dean fell apart, it would mean the whole thing had been a lie. And maybe some part of them, some selfish, uncomfortable part, didn't want to see that. So they waited. Johnny Carson was in his own dressing room, reviewing notes. He had a system. Before every show, he read through the guest list, skimmed a few talking points, made sure there were no surprises. He liked control. He liked preparation. That's how he'd stayed on top for so long. That's how he managed to make live television look effortless. Dean Martin was listed as the third guest. Musical performance, maybe a few stories. Easy. Dean was always easy. He could fill time without trying. He could make the audience love him just by showing up. Johnny trusted that. Then the producer knocked. He didn't wait for an answer. He just opened the door and stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him. His expression was tight, controlled, the kind of face you make when you're trying not to let panic show. Johnny put down his notes. He didn't say anything. He just waited. The producer told him. Johnny's reaction was almost invisible. A slight shift in his posture, a slow exhale. He looked down at his desk, then back up. "Does Dean know?" Johnny asked. "Yes." "Is he still here?" "Yes." Johnny nodded. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. The producer stepped aside. Johnny paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Has anyone told him he doesn't have to do this?" Johnny asked. "We weren't sure if we should." Johnny looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the door and walked down the hall. Dean's dressing room door was closed. Johnny stood outside it for several seconds. He could hear nothing from inside. No movement, no sound, just silence. He knocked, softly. There was a pause. Then Dean's voice came through the door. Calm, even. "Come in." Johnny opened the door slowly. Dean was sitting in the chair by the mirror. He hadn't changed position. His hands were still folded in his lap. His face was composed. If you didn't know what had just happened, you might think he was simply resting before the show. But Johnny knew. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, a few feet away, giving Dean the space to speak first if he wanted to. Dean looked up at him. Their eyes met in the mirror. "They told you," Dean said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," Johnny said. Dean nodded. He looked back down at his hands. "You don't have to do this," Johnny said quietly. "We'll cancel. No one will say a word." Dean was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I'll do it," he said. Johnny didn't respond right away. He studied Dean's face, looking for something, doubt, maybe, or hesitation. Some sign that Dean was forcing himself into something he wasn't ready for. But there was nothing. "Dean," Johnny said carefully, "no one expects you to go out there right now." Dean finally looked up at him. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had. "I know," Dean said, "but if I don't do it now, I won't do it at all." Johnny understood what he meant, because Johnny had seen it before. The moment when grief becomes real, when the shock wears off and the weight comes crashing down. Dean was still in the shock. He was still functioning, and he knew that if he stopped, if he let himself feel it, he wouldn't be able to start again. So Johnny nodded. "Okay," he said. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. "If you change your mind," Johnny said, "just walk off. I'll cover it." Dean didn't answer. He just nodded once. Johnny left the room and closed the door behind him. The Tonight Show taped at 5:30. At 5:15, the audience began filing in. They were laughing, chatting, excited. This was a big deal for most of them, seeing Johnny Carson live, seeing Dean Martin. This was the kind of night they'd tell their friends about. Backstage, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. Cameras were checked, lighting was adjusted. The band ran through their cues. Everything was normal. Everything was on schedule, except for the tension in the hallway outside Dean's dressing room. The producer stood near the door, glancing at his watch. A PA hovered nearby, unsure whether to knock or wait. Johnny was in his usual spot, standing just off stage, hands in his pockets, mentally running through the opening monologue. But his eyes kept drifting toward that hallway. At 5:28, the door opened. Dean stepped out. He was dressed impeccably, suit pressed, hair perfect. The glass was in his hand, prop or real, no one could ever tell. He looked exactly like Dean Martin was supposed to look. He walked past the producer without a word, past the PA, past the crew members who all suddenly found something else to look at. He stopped next to Johnny. Johnny looked at him. Dean looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. Then the stage manager called places, and Johnny walked out to the sound of applause. The monologue went the way it always did. Johnny delivered his jokes. The audience laughed. The band played him off. He sat down at his desk, shuffled his notes, and introduced the first guest. Dean was scheduled for the third segment. That gave him about 40 minutes. He spent it standing in the wings. He didn't sit. He didn't pace. He just stood there, glass in hand, watching the monitors, watching Johnny work, watching the audience react. He looked calm. He looked ready. But if you watched closely, if you knew what to look for, you could see the way his jaw tightened every few minutes, the way his eyes would lose focus for just a moment before snapping back. No one approached him, not the crew, not the other guests. They all gave him space. Whether out of respect or fear, it didn't matter. The result was the same. Dean Martin stood alone. At 6:03, Johnny introduced him. The audience erupted. Dean walked out into the lights. He smiled. He waved. He moved with that loose, easy swagger that had made him famous. He shook Johnny's hand, settled into the guest chair, and crossed his legs. He looked like a man who didn't have a care in the world. Johnny started with something light, a joke about Dean's reputation, a callback to an old story. The audience laughed. Dean laughed with them. His timing was perfect. His delivery was smooth. For a moment, it was easy to forget. But Johnny didn't forget. He watched Dean's face as he spoke. He listened to the rhythm of his words, and he noticed the small things. The way Dean's smile tightened just slightly at the edges, the way his hand gripped the armrest a little too firmly, the way he paused just for a fraction of a second before answering a question. Johnny adjusted. He didn't push. He didn't probe. He kept the conversation light. He gave Dean easy setups. He let him coast, and Dean did. He told a story about Frank Sinatra. He made a joke about the Rat Pack. He sang a few lines of a song when Johnny asked him to. The audience ate it up. They loved him. They always loved him. But Johnny could see it. The effort, the control, the sheer force of will it was taking for Dean to sit in that chair and pretend that everything was fine. The segment lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, Dean stood up. He shook Johnny's hand again. He waved to the audience. He walked off stage to applause. And the moment he stepped out of the lights, his face changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Johnny was paying attention. He watched from his desk as Dean disappeared into the wings. He saw the way Dean's shoulders dropped, the way his head lowered, the way his hand came up to cover his face for just a moment before he kept walking. Johnny finished the show. He thanked his guests, he waved to the audience, he smiled until the camera stopped rolling. Then he stood up and went to find Dean. Dean's dressing room door was closed again. Johnny knocked. This time there was no answer. He waited. Then he opened the door anyway. Dean was sitting in the same chair. The glass was on the table beside him. His jacket was off. His tie was loosened. He didn't look up when Johnny came in. Johnny closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, the same way he had before the show. "You did good," Johnny said quietly. Dean didn't respond. Johnny waited. He knew Dean well enough to know that silence didn't always mean there was nothing to say. Sometimes it just meant there were no words strong enough. After a long moment, Dean finally spoke. "He was supposed to call me last week," Dean said. His voice was low, steady. "We had plans to meet up. He got busy. I got busy. We said we'd do it next month." Johnny didn't say anything. "I didn't know that was the last time," Dean continued. "I didn't know I was supposed to pay attention." "You couldn't have known," Johnny said. Dean shook his head slowly. "That's the thing, John," he said. "You never know. You think you have time. You think there's always going to be a next time. And then there isn't." Johnny swallowed. He didn't trust himself to speak. Dean finally looked up at him. His eyes were dry, but they were different now, hollow, like something inside him had been scooped out. "I didn't want to come out there tonight," Dean said. "I didn't want to smile. I didn't want to make people laugh." "Then why did you?" Johnny asked. Dean was quiet for a moment. "Because if I didn't," he said, "I'd have to sit here and think about it. And I can't do that yet." Johnny understood. He understood it in a way that most people wouldn't, because he knew what it was like to carry something you couldn't show, to hold yourself together when every part of you wanted to fall apart, to perform even when the last thing you wanted to do was be seen. That was the cost of being who they were. "You don't have to carry this alone," Johnny said. Dean gave him a sad, tired smile. "Yeah, I do," he said. "That's the job." Johnny wanted to argue. He wanted to tell Dean that it didn't have to be that way, that he could let people in, that he could ask for help, but he didn't, because deep down, he knew Dean was right. Johnny left the dressing room a few minutes later. He walked down the hallway, past the crew members who were breaking down the set, past the producers who were discussing the next day's lineup, past the PA who asked if he needed anything. He didn't stop until he reached his own dressing room. He closed the door behind him. He sat down at his desk, and for the first time that night, he let himself feel the weight of what had just happened. Not just Dean's loss, but the realization of what Dean had done. The sheer strength it had taken to walk out onto that stage, to smile, to perform, to hold it together when everything inside him was breaking. Johnny had spent decades in this business. He had interviewed hundreds of people. He had seen performances that were technically flawless. He had witnessed moments of genuine brilliance. But what Dean had done tonight was something different. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about talent. It was about survival. And Johnny understood in that moment that he had just witnessed one of the most extraordinary acts of courage he had ever seen. The news broke the next morning. Captain Dean Paul Martin, son of entertainer Dean Martin, killed in plane crash during military training exercise. The headlines were everywhere. The tributes poured in. The cameras showed up at Dean's house. The reporters asked questions he didn't answer. And buried in the coverage, barely mentioned, almost a footnote, was the fact that Dean Martin had appeared on The Tonight Show the same day he learned of his son's death. Some people called it professionalism. Some called it denial. Some didn't know what to call it. But Johnny Carson knew. He knew because he had been there. He had seen it up close. He had watched a man hold himself together through sheer force of will. He had watched a father perform the hardest role of his life, the role of a man who was fine when he was anything but. And Johnny never forgot it. Years later in interviews, people would ask him about the most memorable moments from The Tonight Show. He would talk about the big guests, the famous incidents, the nights that made television history. But he never talked about that night, not publicly. Because some moments aren't meant to be shared. Some moments are too private, too raw, too sacred. That night belonged to Dean Martin, and Johnny Carson honored that silence until the day he died. Dean never spoke about it either. In the weeks and months that followed, he did more shows, he appeared on more stages, he sang more songs, he smiled more smiles. But people who knew him, really knew him, could see the difference. There was a weight to him now that hadn't been there before. A tiredness in his eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. A distance that he carried with him everywhere he went. He still performed, he still showed up, he still did the job. But something inside him had changed. The glass he carried wasn't just a prop anymore. The smile wasn't just an act. Everything was heavier now. Everything took more effort. And yet he kept going, because that's what he had always done. That's what he had learned to do. That's what the world expected from him. The man who made everything look easy, even when it wasn't, even when it was impossible. There's a photograph from that night. It's grainy, poorly lit, taken by someone in the audience with a cheap camera. It shows Dean Martin on stage, mid-laugh. His head is tilted back. His eyes are crinkled at the corners. His mouth is open in what looks like genuine joy. If you didn't know the context, you would never guess. You would never know that just a few hours earlier he had received the worst news of his life. You would never know that he was performing through a grief so profound it would have destroyed most people. You would never know that the smile on his face was an act of will so powerful it defied comprehension. But Johnny Carson knew, and everyone who was backstage that night knew. They saw what the audience didn't. They saw the man behind the performance. They saw the father behind the entertainer. They saw the human being behind the icon. And they understood, in a way that words could never fully capture, the cost of what Dean Martin did that night. In 1987, Dean Martin made his final appearance on The Tonight Show. It was a quiet affair, no big announcement, no farewell tour, just another guest spot on another night. Johnny introduced him the same way he always had. Dean walked out to the same applause. They talked about the same kinds of things, old stories, old friends, old memories. But there was a difference this time. Both of them knew it was the last time. At the end of the segment, as Dean stood up to leave, Johnny reached out and shook his hand. He held it a moment longer than usual. "Thanks for everything, Dean," Johnny said. Dean smiled. That same tired, knowing smile. "You too, John," he said, and then he walked off stage for the last time. Johnny watched him go. He watched until Dean disappeared into the wings. He watched until the lights shifted and the next segment began. And in that moment, Johnny thought about that night in 1987, the night Dean Martin learned his son was dead and still walked on stage. The night that defined more than any other what it meant to be a performer, what it meant to be a professional, what it meant to be Dean Martin. Johnny never asked him about it, not once in all the years that followed, because some things don't need to be said. Some things are understood in silence. And that night, that impossible, unbearable, extraordinary night, was something only the two of them would ever fully understand. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. The tributes came from everywhere. Presidents, actors, musicians, comedians. Everyone who had ever known him, worked with him, or been touched by his work had something to say. But Johnny Carson's tribute was different. It was brief, understated, delivered on The Tonight Show with the same quiet dignity that had always defined Johnny's approach to difficult moments. He didn't talk about Dean's career. He didn't talk about the Rat Pack or the movies or the songs. He talked about strength. He talked about grace. He talked about a man who understood what it meant to carry weight that no one else could see. And though he never mentioned that night specifically, everyone who had been there, everyone who had witnessed it, knew what Johnny was really talking about. He was talking about the moment when Dean Martin proved that some performances aren't about entertaining people. Some performances are about surviving them. Decades later, when people talk about Dean Martin, they talk about the music, the movies, the television shows, the legendary status. They talk about the smooth voice, the effortless charm, the image of a man who never seemed to break a sweat. But they rarely talk about the moments when that image cost him everything. They rarely talk about the nights when he had to choose between falling apart and holding on. They rarely talk about the strength it took to keep going when every part of him wanted to stop. That night, the night he learned his son was dead and still walked on stage, was never meant to be public. It was never meant to be a story people told. It was supposed to be invisible, just like everything else Dean Martin carried. But Johnny Carson saw it, and in seeing it, he understood something that most people never would, that the greatest performances aren't the ones that make people laugh. They're the ones that keep you standing when everything inside you is collapsing. Dean Martin walked on stage that night because he knew that if he didn't, he might never walk on stage again. He smiled because he had spent a lifetime teaching himself to smile through anything. He held it together because that's what he had always done. And Johnny Carson watched him do it. He watched a man perform the impossible. He watched a father bury his grief long enough to entertain a room full of strangers. He watched an icon prove that even legends are human, and he never forgot it. That night, Dean Martin learned something no father should, and still walked on stage smiling. And Johnny Carson learned what it really meant to be strong. Not loud, not dramatic, not obvious, just quiet, just steady, just there, even when there was nowhere left to go.